Okay, welcome back to the second lecture as part of my series on the American Foundation. In this case now we're going to be looking at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So again, these are lectures that are sort of supplementary to my introductory lectures on political theory, and make sure you've hit those first before you get to these, okay? The last lecture in this series we looked at the Declaration of Independence. Now we're going to look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and in the third installment we'll look at the Federalist Papers. Well, so philosophically liberal or Republican? Let's look at the text of the Constitution itself. It's mostly a bunch of articles separating powers between different branches and levels of government. The question is, which set of philosophical ideas makes the most sense of this division of powers? Well, like with the Declaration of Independence, we do get a little bit of each. For example, if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union, it probably leans Republican. But if we link it with the Declaration of Independence, you can certainly make a strong liberal argument in favor. Well, what about separation of powers in the three branches of government? Well, Locke uses a very similar language of executive, judicial, and legislative in the second treatise. So we could derive it, we could use that as evidence saying it's more liberal in nature. At the same time, so does the Baron de Montesquieu. We haven't talked about him as much, but he was a very important French philosopher, and the American founding fathers had all read him as well, just as much as they had read John Locke. And Montesquieu is a little more Republican leaning. And Montesquieu uses the same executive, judicial, and legislative, but has, views it more in the terms of the one, the few, and the many. So one of the other things that Montesquieu did and brought to the table for the American founding fathers was thinking about the Federalist structure of the government. Before Montesquieu, pretty much the sort of received wisdom was that republics had to be little, like the Greek or Italian city-states, sort of very narrowly restricted in territory. And if you got too big, your people were too diverse, it was hard to identify the common good, things just aren't going to work very well. And Montesquieu envisioned this kind of federalist structure that where states, a smaller geographical area, could do most things themselves. So, think of it, it's like each city kind of pretty much gets to do what it wants to do. But that the larger federal government could do international trade and war and some of these bigger things, okay? So that makes it look a little bit more, for emphasizing Montesquieu here, then we're kind of saying, look at the state's local political life. It looks a lot more Republican when we look at it that way. People really are self-governing and deciding things collectively for themselves. And then the federal government is just kind of there to sort of manage, things that might cause states to have tension. You do monetary policy because we need to share one currency, international trade. We, think about my lecture on the Articles of Confederation here, right? Definitely a big improvement. So we can kind of have but what matters here then is the local governments are really telling us sort of what's going on. Additionally, looking at the British heritage, that the founding fathers, again, were well aware of, they were building off the British heritage of the King, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. While this division in Britain was simply a product of history, they never planned it that way. No one sat down and, like the American founding fathers did, and, we're going to write a constitution that's going to work this way. England still does not have an actual formal constitution. They have a bunch of other important documents that collectively we maybe could call a constitution, but they have not written down one sort of set of rights. While this division for Britain was simply a product of history, by the time we get to about 1730, Enlightenment philosophers in Britain are starting to pretty easily assimilate the typology of the king, the lords, and the commons into the one, the few, and the many, and it works really easily, right? So once you have that system up and going, it's easy to use this Republican terminology to make sense of it. And from that, from the British sort of Republican heritage, the Founding Fathers very strongly, not directly, they tinkered with some stuff, but very strongly were able to model the President, the Senate, and the House of Representatives on the one, the few, and the many. This seems pretty strongly Republican in nature, right? It's important so that's a strong sort of Republican argument here. Now let's look at the Bill of Rights. So the main part of the Constitution, okay, well, the preamble, a little bit about the preamble, separation of powers, that's a harder call. But when you get to the branches of government and checks and balances, it definitely starts to look pretty strongly Republican. And you can see that strong Republican influence, much like with the Declaration of Independence, where there's a few moments and you can say, like, look, I mean, you can't argue with this, right? This is very strong. Bill of Rights, however, presents a little bit of a different image. It's important to remember that the Bill of Rights wasn't passed immediately with the Constitution. It was part of a sort of compromise as far as getting the Constitution ratified. Initially, the Bill of Rights didn't even apply to the states. It applied only to the central or federal government. And, with the Bill of Rights, perhaps they're arguably more liberal and leaning, especially because they were initially conceived as a set of individual rights vis-a-vis the federal government. States were allowed to come in and trample on the warrant, they could come search your house. They could restrict freedom of the press. They could actually do all those stuff, all those things. It took a long time through incorporations, called the Incorporation Doctrine, of the Bill of Rights into states to prevent states. Well, let's take a look at them one at a time, more or less. First one, there's a lot going on in the first one. We kind of forget the first one actually covers almost all the things we actually care about today, and then the rest of them cover a bunch of stuff that was really important at the time that we just don't even think about as much anymore. I mean, maybe Second Amendment, accepted here, but so let's look at it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. There's a lot going on here. Religion, speech, press, assembly, all together. Well, the focus on freedom of religion seems to be more liberal in nature, and John Locke was an early advocate of religious toleration. So this is also where the early Pilgrims had a kind of liberal leaning in their desire to defend individual conscience against the right of the state to tell you how to live your life. Okay. Freedom of the press and freedom of the speech is also a bit more liberal leaning. Again, due to the liberal focus on reason, right? So, freedom of press and freedom of speech is terribly important to liberals because without that freedom, how are people going to make genuine arguments and how are you going to be able to hear them sincerely? Freedom of assembly, however, notice they even again appeal to the language of the people. Whenever you see that term, the people, it's almost always more Republican in nature, right? Collective self-determination, the people. So when you get to freedom of assembly, it does seem to emphasize collective self-determination. There you go, lean over a little bit, more than individual reason. Okay, let's look at the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, this one is very Republican. Okay, very, very Republican. Here's why. Free state equals a popular or Republican government where citizens participate in decision-making. Second, a militia is a group activity. Again, this is a practice taken from the British that looks more like what today we would think of as the National Guard. Oops, lost my thing. That today we would think about more as the National Guard, something similar to that. Go this way. There we go. Got to get into the screen. Something more along the lines of the National Guard. Here we are back here. Okay. Notice there is no right, no mention of an individual right to self-protection in your home. That's the liberal way of thinking. I mean, just because the Constitution doesn't say it doesn't mean you don't have the right, okay? So keep that in mind. But, this is one of the things that makes it so strongly, the Second Amendment particularly so strongly, um, Republican. A little more history here. So the image of the citizen soldier, which was very popular amongst Thomas Jefferson, is a key part of the Republican heritage of the American founding. Citizen soldiers were considered better because they would be less likely to engage in foreign wars of aggression, would be more interested in upholding the common good of everyone than the particular good of the army or the generals. And yeah, the army is sometimes more loyal to their generals than the nation, and that can make for a very dangerous situation. This was the problem in Rome. And these were all pretty educated men. They knew the history of Rome better than you do. I promise you that. They all read all the histories on Rome and everything like that. And what's one of the main themes in Roman history, especially later Roman history, is the professional army being more beholden to the generals who brought them new land and wealth and led them to big conquering. They would just come in and march on Rome, and then install their preferred general as the emperor of Rome. That's a problem, right? That is definitely a problem. So let's take a look at the rest of these. No quartering of troops in home, no unreasonable search and seizure, some legal stuff, no double jeopardy, no treason without a grand jury, no self-incrimination. 6 is trial by jury. 7 is trial by jury for cases over $20 of value. Article 8, no excessive bail. And then 9 and 10 basically say together, there are other rights not explicitly granted by the Bill of Rights, and those are held by the people or the states, but definitely not the federal government. So how are we going to separate these out? Well, I should actually say here, well, notice how so many of them have to do with the judiciary. This is because the King of England was using his power to appoint judges and manipulate trials to make the colonists' lives extremely difficult. So let's look at the jury. Is it more liberal or more Republican? Well, liberals like neutral judges, right? Locke talks about impartial judges. Doesn't seem like that's actually what they're doing here. So for Republicans, however, the juries equal the people deciding legal cases, and obviously the people are going to be partisan a little bit towards their own interests. And this was a little bit purposeful. It's a bit of a democratic element in the judicial system, what we would think of as the many. And this was very important to British republicanism. It's not actually an impartial jury, but that one that will keep the needs of the many in mind when making decisions. So notice the difference here with the Supreme Court, which probably is a set of at least roughly impartial judges, and which seems to shift in alliances between the few and the many depending on circumstance, right? So sometimes they're a little more conservative and maybe a little more the few. Sometimes they're a little more liberal and maybe, or lefty, a little bit more of the many. But what if we just picked people to make Supreme Court decisions the same way we pick a jury for a criminal trial, right? Let them decide on Citizens United or whatever. Certainly they wouldn't have the same technical know-how, but their sort of natural inclination would be to do what's in the interests of people like themselves, the many, right? But there's some really strong liberal tendencies here. So, the conventional wisdom is it's maybe a little bit more liberal. Maybe the Bill of Rights is almost exactly even Steven. I don't know. One of the key things to remember here is, again, individual rights vis-a-vis the federal government. So that makes it look automatically a bit more liberal, but their language really gets Republican-y sometimes. So no quartering of troops. Well, that's no use of my property without my consent. You can't just come in and tell me what we're going to do. No unreasonable search and seizure. No self-incrimination. These all seem really strongly liberal. So I've sort of hit the Republican highlights, but they're pretty strongly liberal leaning. They could be understood on a Republican foundation. Ask yourself this question. Do you get these rights because you're a person and they are natural rights, or do you get them because you're an American citizen and the Constitution guarantees this to you, right? Hard to say. Liberals distinctly lean towards the natural rights answer, and Republicans towards the American citizen answer. The last two are pretty tough, okay, and they hit at some really important issues here. Notice that other rights held by the people is probably more Republican in nature. Held by the people, not by persons or individuals, right? So these are rights that they're saying, look, you get sort of collectively, not individually. But there's also a lot of natural law here as well. I mean, if there are these other rights, well, what are they? Where do they come from? They have to come from somewhere, I'm assuming, right? Rights don't come from nowhere. And if they come from somewhere, and they're not in the Constitution, well, they got to be natural rights, probably. Republicans can work around that. That's a little bit of a sort of longer digression. We don't need to get too hung up on that. So that brings us to the end of the second lecture on the political philosophy of the American founding, looking specifically at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.